Welcome and hello. I'm Nancy Cope, here to introduce you to a new program on HHTV called Writers Read. Linda and Paul Niebank have designed another chance for us to hear our friends read what they've been writing. And you already know what you might hear. A memoir, maybe a short story, or maybe a work in progress. In the past, these have been live performances or events. This time, of course, they're videotaped. Count on Horizon House to adapt and move forward. I'm going to read you the dates of these events. November 24th, 7 plus 7, December 1st, December 8th, and December 15th. Now let's hear our readers tonight. Back, and it kind of infers that we've been someplace. And maybe we have been someplace, but welcome back. It's good to see everybody. And welcome to our readers today, and it's Peter Elbow, it is Barbara Ray, and it is Bob Corwin. So we welcome them, and we thank Linda and Paul Niebank for gathering us together today. It's really nice. And Risa, we appreciate your skills and your cheer. We always start these sessions with Paul's poem. So are you ready? I say a line, you say a line. You ready? Right, right, right.
Right, 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 right.
Until you get it right.
Until you get it right.
Then read aloud.
Read aloud.
You'll draw a crowd.
You'll draw a crowd.
And give us great delight.
And give us great delight.
And I'm glad that Peter Elbow is the first reader today, because Peter, the second line of Paul's poem worries me just a little bit. Until you get it right. When is it right, Peter? Thank you for coming, and I'm looking forward to hearing you, Peter.
Well, you keep working on it till the deadline comes, and then you do it tomorrow. So I want to talk about today, but thank you very much for making this happen, and a chance to talk about something very close to my heart. It was an appendix essay in my very first book in 1973, and I've been chewing on it and working at it ever since 1973. The doubting game and the believing game. And two basic forms of thinking, two basic ways we use our minds. I celebrate the believing game. The doubting game is part of our culture. But those are abstract words. Let me start by looking at two concrete examples. I often go to a Quaker meeting, and there's a woman named Doreen Cornwall there, and she recently wrote this. I'm sitting here with this weird need to pray for disgruntled, socially maladjusted, middle-aged white guys with guns. This group is at high risk for suicide and easy marks for the kind of bilge floating around in our culture right now. None of this excuses monstrous acts, and I'm not sure what's supposed to come from my prayers, but I am certain that prayers are needed for them and for us. So she gives us a striking example of believing. She doesn't want us to give up on these guys. Another example, I want to look at doubting and believing in Shakespeare's Othello. He symbolizes belief by focusing on a love between a black man and a white woman. Desdemona is an innocent young white woman from Venice, and Othello is an unsophisticated general, a black man from Africa, and he's been through everything except corrupt city life like he finds in Venice. So this black African whom Shakespeare presents as, in a way, primitive. Othello, he wins the heart of this elegant white lady from Venice. There's belief. Love can conquer all difference. And doubt? There's Iago, the villain of the play. Iago is Othello's highly trusted lieutenant, but he manages to destroy everything. The play shows us that Iago need only plant a tiny seed of doubt and play some mind games, and he can slowly but successfully undermine the miraculous love. He sows a seed of jealousy and gradually waters the seed of baseless jealousy, like playing a trout on the end of a fragile fishing line. And by the end of the play, he can bring Othello to the point where he actually strangles to death the woman he still loves with all his heart. Shakespeare wants to contrast the fragility of belief and the power of doubt. So we learn from Socrates about doubt. Folks, in a way, naively just believe what you hear. I believed that when they gave me a spoonful of horseradish to eat when I was a little kid. Socrates, in a way, was the pioneer of doubting. And Descartes was the pioneer of what we call the doubting game, learning how to doubt things. Even if you know the truth, let's try and doubt it. Let's look at it through the lens of doubt. That's Descartes. Socrates, for his doubt, he paid with his life for doubting the main ideas of his culture. So the mantra for doubt is, your idea sounds good, but it might be false. And we've been misled all of our history by people who seduced us with ideas that sound true but are wrong. We need to doubt it. That's the doubting game. And I'm all for this. I have no doubts to throw out against doubt. But I am advocating the opposite, the believing game, which is under-celebrated, under-recognized. So for the believing game, the mantra is, your idea sounds crazy, but let's try hard to believe it, and maybe we'll find out that it's actually true, or right, or valid. The point is that we can't see what's good or true about an idea that sounds crazy unless we first take the risk of trying to believe it. That's my argument. So, the believing game. Let me contrast these two ways of using the mind, doubting and believing. Phenomenologically, the doubting game teaches us to guard ourselves, to fend off, to spit out. The believing game teaches us to welcome or swallow. It's not easy. Trying to believe an alien idea can make us fear being changed, polluted, even intellectually raped. And if you've tried to present an idea that other people think is crazy, you see how hard it is to get them to entertain it even, much less believe it. With regard to learning, the doubting game teaches us to extricate or detach ourselves from ideas in order to see them more clearly from the outside. But if we want to understand new ideas, and if we're teachers, if we want students to understand ideas that they don't yet understand, we have to teach them to enter in, to believe them, to try and believe it. That sounds crazy, but let's believe it. Because then, only then will they begin to understand it. So we have to teach our students to enter in before teaching them to doubt. And so often in our culture, teachers feel like, well, we have to teach critical thinking. We have to teach them to doubt everything. But it's no use trying to doubt things. I mean, there's no use teaching students to doubt if they haven't yet learned, if they haven't yet internalized. And to learn to enter into new ideas, not just words, but images and beliefs, and images and sounds and body movements are particularly helpful. If I'm trying to teach students ideas that they find alien, if we can do drawings, if we can make sounds and body movements, especially if we can role play the role of that person who's very different from you. Try and act it out. What would they say that people can do things if they make up stories and they role play that they have trouble doing with their logical minds. The doubting game teaches us the value of disengaging from action, standing back, commenting from the sidelines. And this is good. This helps us to see flaws we overlook when we jump in an act. But my argument is that we are one-sided and we're not very good at learning and we're not very good at understanding other people unless we can also enter in to ideas that feel alien to us. Sometimes we can't understand something until we're engaged with it. Tertullian said, believe so that you may understand. Sometimes you have to believe first if you want to understand something. And the word hypothesis itself, hypothesis means hypo is above. Stand up above and look over and try and on what's on the other side of the fence, because you can't judge it until you can take it in. There's an interesting gender correlation. The doubting game promotes ways of using the mind and interacting with other people that in our culture have been associated with masculinity. Arguing, resisting, saying no, pushing back, competing, and being aggressive. That's good for doubting. If you want to doubt, people do that. And that tends to be what we call good thinking, critical thinking. But it does correlate with who knows what the biology is, but in culturally, that's related to masculine behaviors. And the believing game is associated and it correlates with what we teach in our culture, or what gets correlated in our culture with femininity, listening, absorbing, swallowing, accepting, saying yes, being compliant, not arguing back. So when women play the doubting game and they argue back aggressively, they're sometimes seen as less feminine. And when men play the believing game and they don't argue and they try to listen and take it in and swallow another idea without arguing, they're often seen as less masculine. So those are the two ways of coming at thinking that I have found very useful in my life. And I'm not arguing for one or the other, but I'm arguing the doubting game is rewarded in our culture, especially our intellectual culture, and the believing game is a little bit frowned on and seen as non-intellectual. And my argument is that learning to believe an idea that is alien to you is a very intellectual thing to do, and many people who are called smart in our culture can't do it. And they have a limitation in their smartness because they're not good at entering into the views of people they don't like or they don't understand. And I tend to judge people. Can that person enter into views that they don't like? That to me is the test of something that's rare and very precious. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Lots of wisdom, lots of food for thought.
Okay.
Thank you, Peter, so much. Food for thought, a lot of wisdom in that reading today. Thank you. And my friend Barbara, thank you for writing a book with this title, Don't Push the River. You know me well enough to know I tend to push the river. And this wonderful title, especially in these days, there is a river we can't push. So thank you, Barbara. Good to see you and welcome.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity. I think as I'm preparing for this, I realized that the stories I've chosen are my experiences from a child in reality, survival, and humor. The first story is during the war in England, and so I'll just start. It was 1944, and nowhere in England was safe from German attack. The past 4 years had taken us to Somerset, Yorkshire, and now we were in North Wales. Now the enemy's attention had been diverted away from England, and my mother dared to take advantage of the lull in air raids to hope that Hitler's focus on battles in North Africa and Italy would keep them away from London. She decided it was time to bring us home and take our chances together and to try to be a family again. For the last time, my mother set out on the long drive to North Wales to bring us home. My little sister Sheila and I were so relieved to get away from the convent, where we'd spent 2 miserable years, having learned nothing or enjoyed anything. There'd been too many interruptions in those 4 years, and I'd lost all interest in school and all ability to learn. My mother's war work was now part-time, since the need for ambulance drivers was not so urgent. And now we were all together again, and there was a sense of life at home. One day, when she and I were home, she called me to come quickly, pointing to a wingless, noisy object flying across the sky with flames coming out its back. She told me she'd just heard on the wireless that Hitler had launched a secret weapon. It was called a V-1 rocket, and Churchill called it a doodlebug. It was a pilotless bomb. It was launched in Europe and would keep flying until the fuel ran out. Then it would drop and explode on landing. When the engine noise stopped, she said, we should head for safety and, if possible, and time allowed, get into one of the shelters. We were well prepared with corrugated steel Anderson shelter in the garden and an indoor Morrison shelter in the sitting room. The Morrison was the size of a table tennis table, made of steel, and designed to support the weight of a collapsed house on top of it. But one summer afternoon, after we'd been home and settled in school for only a few months, we lost the gamble. That afternoon, I just returned home from the hairdresser, and I'd had a Marcel wave, an indescribable optimism that I would have lovely curly hair. I'd been home long enough to raid the pantry for my favorite snack, a slice of bread and dripping, and was still indoors fussing with my hair. My mother had just come in the hallway from the garden and was prodding me to get on with my homework. Suddenly, we both heard the familiar sound of the doodlebug. The sputtering engine got closer and closer. We'd become accustomed to paying nervous attention to this new sound, and we knew this one was getting close. As its loud engine began to fade, we heard the unmistakable swishing of the pilotless rocket coasting through the air. We headed immediately for the Morrison shelter in the sitting room, but there was no time to reach it. We froze in the hallway. The last thing I knew was the sudden, complete cutout overhead of the buzz, the swish of a heavy object sashaying through the air, then an immense explosion which I only realized later I had felt, not heard. From where I stood, pushed by the blast against the wall, I saw glass, ceiling plaster, pieces of wood, doors, furniture swirling slowly, very slowly around me. I couldn't see my mother, and as the dust began to settle, I found myself out on the lawn in the front garden with our old Scotty dog in my arms. I don't remember picking her up. There was no sense of panic. My mother appeared nearby. She was covered from head to toe in white dust. She looked at me and burst out laughing. My new permanent was frizzy from the blast and standing out on end. I was wearing the only halo I ever owned in my life. Debris was settling around us everywhere. The bomb had fallen at the bottom of the garden, leaving a shallow crater, removing all trace of our rabbit hutches, fences and trees. The house was still standing, but the windows and roof were gone. I could hear the non-stop chiming of the grandfather clock. The pendulum had been dislodged, so that the hours chimed incessantly, and the minute and hour hands raced around her ancient face with the sailing ship painted on it, only to stop when the weights finally ran down. Out of the settling chaos, still at dream speed, strangers began to appear. I wondered what all these people were doing here in the house. Total strangers and the occasional familiar face, seeming as if on a mission, were unaccountably wandering through the wreck of our home, some of them picking up small things, small enough to fit in their pockets, and moving others which didn't. Months later, as we began to reclaim our lives and belongings, we realized that some of the missionaries had come to help with light fingers, open pocket, and larceny in their hearts. The impressions which remain with me are the absence of sound when explosion occurred, the sensation of blast like an invisible pressure on my body and skin, everything happening in very precise slow motion, and most of all, the discovery that we would never have survived had we actually made it to the indoor shelter. While it was constructed to bear the weight of the house, the steel mesh sides of the shelter were no protection against the flying glass from the French doors, even though blankets were hung over the mesh to shield against the floor draft. The glass splintered had shredded the fabric and the bedding inside. While this air raid was going on, my father was on the train coming home from his office in London. As he often did, he had fallen asleep and so missed Petswood Station, probably saving his life. My little sister, Sheila, the family sweet tooth, had gone to the bunny sweet shop in the village. She too was safely out of harm's way. But when she was finally allowed through the police cordon surrounding the bombed area to look for us after the explosion, she was frantic. She found the unexpected ruin of her home. She said she had been desperate when the air raid wardens wouldn't let her through the cordon unaccompanied, leaving her a panicked 10-year-old, not knowing whether we were dead or alive. Friends appeared amidst the rubble and gathered us up in their homes until my parents could make new arrangements. My mother had suffered a collapsed lung from the blast. It was decided that we should return to North Wales with my mother to stay until she could recover. We spent the next few weeks together trying to make sense from the overall shock before we travelled north. In my mind, there were just three things I was concerned about. Would I really have to take the all-important school exam coming up? Would I ever be able to untangle my bomb-frizzed hair? But the thing that worried me most was the recurring nightmare I had every night for a long time. I fell into a cellar which had no stairs, and I didn't know how far I would fall and what would happen when I hit bottom. So, 25 years later, on the light side, I'm going to tell you a little bit about San Francisco, where I had moved to. I had married a San Franciscan. We were sailors, and all year we looked forward to our summers afloat in the San Francisco Bay Delta. Each year we'd select a different slough, even though we had the choice of hundreds of possible anchorages. We could expect solitude, silence interrupted only by the sound of birds, water lapping around the sides of the boat, and a hot sun in the cloudless sky. Given a few days, our bones would dry out from the cold, foggy climate San Francisco called summer. Early in July, every year, we would provision our sturdy Danish folk boat with enough food for a couple of weeks of cruising. And as we crossed the bay, heading towards the sun shining through the clouds in Marin County, the last thing we often heard was that wonderful sound of the foghorns on Golden Gate Bridge. Each year we would try to get away as early as we could on a Friday so that we could reach our destination by late afternoon. Swaddled in sweaters and oilskins, we left our berth in the marina and sailed with the tide upstream north to the immense delta area of the rivers, canals and waterways flowing through the richly fertile farmlands. By the time we reached the Carquinez Bridge, where the rivers forked, The sun was beating down and we'd stripped to our swimsuits, set the sails wing and wing to catch the light wind. A few hours later, as the sun was falling behind the stand of poplars growing alongside open stretch of water, we had arrived. Not a soul was in sight. Drifting toward the bank of the river, we dropped an anchor. Eventually, Bob swam ashore and tied a stern line to one of the trees. We rigged the awning across the boom sheltering the cockpit, poured 2 glasses of wine, and sat watching the sun's rays play across the water as it sank lower. We ate a light supper and thought of sleep. Out of nowhere, the sound of an outboard motor buzzing became louder and louder. Instead of passing by unseen, we were really startled to see a large floating houseboat barreling straight towards us. With hundreds of miles of water around us to choose from, they clearly had a herding instinct. Without hesitation, the stubby bow was driven up the bank of the river about 20 yards from us. Engines were cut, a horde of kids had exploded from inside, cannonballed over the side, splashing and squealing. Women shouted instructions, men threw a short rope onto shore, tied up haphazardly around the trunk of a tree. Blaring music thumped as if to beat silence into submission. Finally, the group wore themselves out, and we were relieved to be absorbed into the night. Until dawn, that is. Woken by the sound of revving motors, more yelling, and the unmistakable smell of hot blue smoke, we weren't quite prepared for the scene we found when we looked through the companion from our bunks. The wretched houseboat was hanging down the bank at quite an angle from its sorry piece of ragged rope, abandoned by the outgoing tide. Try as they might to make the propeller on the outboard motor take hold in the shallow water, the relentless boaters finally decided there was nothing they could do but wait for the tide to return. We turned our backs on them, took an early morning skinny dip, and a couple of hours went by and we saw the tide begin to turn. Then the flood raced in. Bob went below to the head, taking yesterday's newspaper with him, and I settled in the cockpit for the first nap of the day. But not for long. The roar of approaching engines warned me to look around, only to see the houseboat, now suddenly released from the bank, hurtling towards us, quite out of control. I leapt to my feet, and Bob sat helplessly below. As they sped by, barely missing our port side by 3 inches, I stood in the cockpit indignant. Tested far beyond my vacation lethargy, I shook my fists at them, warning them, "Nothing gives me greater pleasure than to see you leave. You have no right to be let loose in this water paradise," I continued, doubting they could even hear or even care. "Never, ever come anywhere near us again. Furthermore," I said, "I hope you run aground." Bob said that as I stood in the cockpit, he could just see me from his disadvantaged position. He told me he'd been quite impressed. I had called forth in impeccable style as I delivered my warning without repeating myself, raising my voice or uttering a single profane word. Incredibly, 100 yards down the slough, the ungainly monster and its crew of unredeemable landlubbers ran aground.
Oh, Barbara, what a good 15 minutes of your life from London to San Francisco. Thank you so much. It's great. Welcome, Bob Corwin. You might not realize, but I have been in a writing group when you have been in a writing group from time to time. And there's 2 words that describe you in a writing group that I need in my life. You would walk in the writing group and the 2 words are, you would be quietly focused.
Oh.
I need to be quietly
Look-
focused.
Look like you know what you're doing.
Welcome, Bob.
Thank you. So with Peter's leadership, some of us have been writing, and here's pages. I'm writing a short biography of my great-great Aunt Alice, who was born in New Haven, Connecticut, just before the Civil War, and had an interesting life. And I pulled out a chapter from the middle of that story, and it's about the origin of her best friend, where she came from, around the other side of the world, and then at the end of the chapter, they meet in New Haven. I'm not sure we'll get there. It may go beyond 15 minutes, but we'll see. This chapter is entitled 1866, Another Civil War. In July of 1868, a crane gliding over Aizu province would see within a ring of mountains greening terraced hillsides, descending a valley to the town of Wakamatsu, overlorded by her namesake Tsuruga Castle, with sloping wing-like eaves, above galleries of heavy timber, tiled tiers over the anchoring citadel. Earthbound life. 20 feet thick at the waterline, its white walls rose 50 feet. 500 acres within the outer moat and walls enclosed granaries, stables, houses, and the lives of samurai retainers supporting the daimyo of the castle. Wakamatsu lay 100 miles north of Edo, it's modern Tokyo. For centuries, Tsuruga Castle was seat of lords and samurai loyal to the shogun, who ruled from Edo over hundreds of local warlords throughout Japan. The emperor remained in ceremonial isolation in Kyoto. If the crane had come later that summer, she would have swerved, rode the currents of another valley, skirting a hinge of history below. Japan's brief chaos, inexorable turn, percussive booming, gyres of smoke. Gunfire announced arrival of the Boshin War. August 23, 1868, from a timbered tower, clanging of an urgent bell, people astir, headlong for the castle gates. A melee on the ground as 30,000 soldiers of the emperor entered the town, attacking this bastion of shogun loyalty. Tsuruga Castle was besieged. Smoke roiled as thousands of houses burned. Samurai families who declined the castle's crowded shelter, some robed in white, with purposed knives, chose ritual suicide. By the 1800s, a little jump in time here, by the 1800s, more than 2 centuries under the Tokugawa shoguns had brought stability and prosperity to Japan. But domestic peace and their country's intended isolation had left Japan vulnerable. Advanced weapons had allowed Western powers the edge to dominate expanding areas of East Asia. July 1853, the key was turned. Commodore Perry's 4 American gunboats entered Edo Bay. Japan now forced to open its doors to the West. A new faction from the South was convinced that Japan could withstand the Western powers only by emulation. The alliance aimed to abolish the shogun and its medieval bureaucracy, restore the emperor to power, and centralize control over a modern state. This group acquired weapons from Europe, and united behind the emperor to revolutionize Japan. January 1868, imperial forces occupied Edo Castle. The shogunate was abolished, the emperor restored to power. Resistance continued in the north. Aizu was center of a 5-domain alliance in a last-ditch campaign against the new regime. Tsuruga Castle was well fortified, but its ancient weapons, including bamboo-bound wooden cannon with stone projectiles, were no match for the European weapons of imperial forces, including 60 pieces of artillery. As the siege tightened, samurai families remained on duty. Tsurumatsu's father was chief retainer to the lord of Aizu domain. She had grown up in the castle compound. 8 years old, the girl ran through courts and passages of the castle with lead shot and cartridges for the men on defense. Imperial cannon tormented the castle. Women ran to smother the fallen shells with wet quilts. Her sister-in-law, Tose, ran toward a shell when it exploded, grazing Tsurumatsu's neck, but striking Tose mortally in the chest. Besieged for a month, the castle surrendered September 22nd, a place of devastation. Conquest of Tsuruga Castle assured imperial victory in the Boshin War. The siege had cost the lives of almost half the nearly 6,000 casualties of the war. As defenders opposed to the new regime, Tsurumatsu, her mother and sisters were sent to internment camp. She had experienced more than most adults of the catastrophe of war. Tose's excruciating death, unburied bodies, and now displacement to prison camp. Her oldest brother, Hiroshi, was responsible for the thousands of defenders of the castle, prisoners for the next several years. Their family shared the life of thousands of prisoners: lice, lethal cold, hunger. Her other brother, Kanjiro, had escaped from prison camp. He furtively pursued studies in Tokyo, concealing his Aizu past with changes of alias and location. August 1871, the Emperor Meiji summoned the daimyos to the capital. His pronouncement: all domains and their boundaries were hereby abolished, replaced by new prefectures responsible to Tokyo. The Meiji government sent delegations to the West to observe and gather what they needed to bring Japan onto the world stage. In America, they were hosted at receptions, met with business, political, and military leaders. The Meiji delegate, Kiyotaka Kuroda, was stunned by American women. They were visible and respected partners of their husbands, had opinions, and spoke up. In public, men tipped their hats, gave up their seats, made way on the sidewalk. Here was the key. The leaders in government, business, military had wife partners in steady emotional and, yes, intellectual support. No wonder America had surged ahead in technology, industrial achievement. Her leaders had the energizing advantage of confident, inspiring women. How had this come about? Clearly, it was education of women in the upper classes. Visible and vocal women had been allowed an education. Kuroda was convinced Japan would remain behind while it kept its women subservient. They must be enabled to take their place as working partners with their husbands and leaders if Japan would rise to respect in a changing world. He wrote a memo to his government. In 1871, Tomomi Iwakura planned a mission to bring more than 40 Meiji delegates to America to learn more of Western progress. Young men were already there, eager scholars at prestigious schools. Why not send some girls to learn English in Western ways? Prepare them to return and prepare their sisters as partners in their country's future. Kuroda set about recruiting for girls to live with American families and bring back an education. The offer looked attractive. 10 years in America, all expenses paid, including an $800 a year stipend for each. The first recruitment effort brought no response. Not all Japan was ready to abandon centuries of tradition. Why deprive girls in their teen years of preparation for their vital role of obedient partner and manager of their husband's household? Who would send their daughters away 10 years of their girl young womanhood to some barbarian stronghold, home to the noisy, red-nosed, strange-smelling, inordinate eaters of flesh and wearers of dirty shoes into the domestic precinct? A second round of recruiting aimed at samurai families, their losing side in the Boshin War, had cost them livelihood and prestige. But modern Japan needed their energy and discipline. Sudamatsu's brother, Kenjiro, had sailed to America in 1871 at age 16 and now studied at Norwich Free Academy in Connecticut, preparing for Yale. Her oldest brother, Hiroshi, was now attached to the Meiji government. Sudamatsu had seen more of wartime trauma than most adults. A foreign mission and education could not exceed the trials already passed, and any distinction of Western culture she might bring back could only help restore the family's standing. In October 1871, Hiroshi informed her of the plan. Her destination was outlandish, but with traditional obedience, she promptly packed for America. Applications from 4 other families of samurai daughters were received and all immediately accepted. The 5 girls met first in Tokyo amid hectic preparations for their 10-year absence. Dressed for court, top-heavy in coiled coifs, the 5 were led in awestruck wonder through refurbished corridors of Edo Palace. In a royal hall from behind a screen, the young Empress Haruko bestowed imperial blessing. They would be the first girls sent abroad for a foreign education and first ever of samurai rank at an audience with the Empress. The girls embarked with a delegation in Yokohama in late December 1871 for America. The 2 oldest were 14, Ryo Yoshimatsu and Tei Ueda. Sudamatsu Yamakawa was 11, Shiga Nagai 10, and Ume Tsuda only 6. Shiga had also experienced the war. In July 1868, imperial forces had occupied Edo Castle and replaced the shogun with the young Emperor Meiji. But pockets of resistance continued, including her neighborhood near the castle. The resistance came under fire and was defeated. She was taken to see the losers' heads mounted on poles. It was a terrible sight, she said. Her older brother, Takashi, recruited her for the Iwakura mission. Like Shiga, Umetsuda had spent her early childhood in Tokyo. Her father, Sen, had traveled to America and was intrigued with Western ways. Returning to Japan from America, he insisted Ume, then 3 years old, begin learning to read and write. She was bright, engaged, spoke a little English by age 6. From the losing side in the Boshin War, Sen, Ume's father, struggled to support his family. Sending his daughter to America would ease the burden. And if she returned with fluent English and an understanding of the West, it could help his image with the Meiji government. 3 would remain in America for 10 years, becoming sisters there, relieving their isolation in this new world. The Yokohama Pier was filled with families, officials, and well-wishers. Many were there for the men in the Iwakura mission to the United States and Europe to introduce the West to the ambitious, sophisticating Meiji government, continue learning, and, not least, to redress treaties imposed on the earlier, weaker Shogun regime. Launches ferried over 100 delegates to America. The Pacific Mail side-wheel steamship, one of the largest in the world. Passengers lined the rail. At noon, the anchors rose, the great wheels churned, and the ship headed out to sea. The small craft dropped behind as the well-wishers waved America on to San Francisco. The girls shared a cabin and began to get acquainted. In between in age, Tsudamatsu was seen as younger sister by the oldest 2, Ryo and Tei. She foreshadowed quiet strength and reassurance to the year younger Shiga and to Ume, who turned 7 on the journey. The Pacific in winter is a large and sometimes seasick ocean. 2 of the men checked in with the girls, helping to right the cabin. Hirobumi Ito, a senior ambassador, comforted their stomachs and spirits with misozuki pickle from home. The 3-week voyage ended as America entered the Golden Gate on January 18th, 1872. Well into the day, but with fog still in San Francisco Bay. The city gave festive welcome to the mission. A few days of hotel comfort on stable land helped ready them for departure January 31st from San Francisco by rail across the continent, destined for their country's mission in the U.S. Capitol. Time to talk together, take in a world of spectacle, vastness, rail tunnel through soaring mountains, high mountain plains, stops at settlements, and noisy people with intrusive curiosity. Heavy snow stranded the train in Utah with an unplanned 3 weeks in Salt Lake City. Through the 2-month journey, the 5 remained together, usually separate from the men. But Ito visited their rooms and told children's tales and stories from home. So that's what we have time for. Anyway, Tsudamatsu became the best friend of my great-great-aunt Alice, and to be continued.
Oh my, I want to know what happens.
Okay.
I don't know how we get to do that.
I am fishing for an invitation. For
Okay, we'll have to continue this. And thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Really delightful.
Thank you.
And I don't think I mentioned that Linda and Paul have called this event Writers Read. And I just love those 2 words together. Writers Read. And so thank you, writers, for reading today. Peter, Barbara, and
Our
Bob.
pleasure.
Very nice. Thank you so much. You have just heard 3 readers of the 50 readers who have read and shared their writing with us since 2018. Ina Bray had this idea that writers should share what they've written by reading their writing. I'd like to share with you the 50 people who have shared. John Longcris, Bernice Kastner, Peter Elbow, Grant Hildebrand, Judy Brown, Donald Meyer, Artis Palmer, Jean Durning, Simon Ottenberg, Anne-Marie Godston, Joan Singler, Erwin Saracen, Phyllis Van Orton, Beth Davis, Bob Fitzgerald, Melissa Fall, Estella Leopold, David Gucci, Brace Popoff, Jean Carlson, Audrey Whitecamp, Phyllis Lamphere, Marianne Anderson, Bill Anderson, Carol Ottenberg, Red McVitie, Barbara Ray, Ina Bray, John Clement, Gordon Orions, Jane Hastings, Jesse Abtree, Nancy Rust, Peter Corning, Paul Niebank, Ray Tufts, Abe Bergman, Lee Scheingold, Maid Adams, Sue Lynch, Pat Decker, Ann Ormsby, Norman Hirsch, Ann Pound, Bill Stark, Marcia Iverson, Bob Corwin, Cassandra Carruthers, and Mary Piet. What an amazing time we've had with all of you, and thank you all for sharing with us.